Many of you may already have seen clips being passed around from one of the greatest interviews ever given with PFLP's Ghassan Kanafani in 1970, 2 years before his assassination at the hands of Israel. Not only was he a brilliant Palestinian activist and writer, he was also a friend of my grandfather because they were both leftist revolutionary writers and journalists in Beirut during the 60s. He was a journalist, playwright, poet, and author. His most famous works are probably the book Men in the Sun and Other Palestinian Stories, and the novella Return to Haifa, both of which have been adapted into various films and plays since. Recently, there was also a translation of his work on Zionist literature, and if you ain't got time for that, his work of short fiction, Letter from Gaza, is available in full online, and you can read it in a few minutes. As a writer, Kanafani eschewed the more popular, dry, hyper-intellectual tone of Arabic language writing in the 50s and 60s, instead adopting a manner of allegory, satire, and outright humor, including in his journalism, which was generally unheard of at the time. This added a general layer of nuance, complexity, relatability, accessibility, and just overall timelessness, to the point that his works are definitely still being performed today, including in Israel. Sadly, his voice was stolen from us too young, as in 1972, 2 years following that famous interview, in a string of extraterritorial assassinations, Israel murdered him and his niece via car bomb. He was only 36 years old, and Lamis Najim, his niece, was 17 and already proving to be a promising voice in the fight for Palestinian liberation. These were some of the other members of Palestinian liberation movements who were assassinated by Israel from 1972 to 1973. Pretty much every name on this list was not a combatant or militant. They were intellectuals, spokespeople, politicians, and artists who had nothing in common but an idea. And it was that idea of Palestinian liberation and resistance, more than any individual, that Israel was trying to eradicate with this and their long habit of extraterritorial assassinations, an ongoing attempt that has repeatedly and utterly failed. Because it was much less clear then than it is now that an idea cannot be killed, so long as there are those who still believe in it and fight for it with all their heart. And that is the true, lasting legacy of Ghassan Kanafani, the liberation fighter who never fired a gun.
It seems that the civil war, has been quite fruitless.
It's not a civil war. It's a people defending themselves against a fascist government, which you are defending. It's not a civil war.
Well, the conflict...
It's not a conflict. It's a liberation movement fighting for justice.
Well, whatever it might be best called.
It's not whatever, because this is where the problem starts. This is a people who is discriminated, is fighting for his rights. This is a story.
Why won't your organization engage in peace talks with the Israelis?
You don't mean exactly peace talks. You mean capitulation, surrendering.
Why not just talk?
Talk to whom?
Talk to the Israeli leaders.
That's kind of conversation between the sword and the neck, you mean?
Well, if there were no swords and no guns in the room, you could still talk.
No, I had never seen any talk between a colonialist case and a national liberation movement.
But despite this, why not talk?
Talk about what?
Talk about the possibility of not fighting.
Not fighting for what?
Not fighting at all, no matter what for.
Yeah, and people usually fight for something and they stop fighting for something. So you can't tell me even why should we speak about what?
Well, stop fighting.
For what? Or talk about stop fighting, why?
Talk to stop fighting, to stop the death and the misery, the destruction, the pain.
The misery and the destruction and the pain and the death of whom?
Of Palestinians, of Israelis, of Arabs.
Of the Palestinian people who are uprooted, thrown in the camps, living in starvation, killed for 20 years, and forbidden to use even the name Palestinians.
They're better that way than dead, though.
Maybe to you, but to us, it's not. To us, to liberate our country, to have dignity, to have respect, to have our mere human rights, is something as essential as life itself.
What is the aims? Is it to get back the land that Israel occupied in 1967, or is it to get back the land they occupied in 1948?
The resistance movement is a liberation movement. To the Palestinian people, it's the continuous step of the tragedy which started at 1948. We couldn't, as Palestinians, separate between Nazarite, for example, and Jerusalem. I myself couldn't find any difference. I couldn't find difference between Jaffa, my city where I was born, and Ramallah in the West Bank, or Gaza. To us, it's one nation, one homeland.
The Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine is a part of the Palestinian Liberation Movement. And the Palestinian Liberation Movement aims to build a democratic Palestine where all sorts of discrimination, either they are economical or religious or national or social, are supposed to be cancelled. We believe that because of the nature of contradiction between the Palestinian and the Arab National Liberation Movement and between the enemy, which is Israel and the World Zionist Movement and the world imperialism, because of the nature of this contradiction, there is only one way to solve it, and that is through the people's armed struggle. This long people's war is supposed to be the way the people impose their will against their enemies and build the society where everybody in it, regardless of its religion or national background or economical situation, will be equal. I want first to notice that among the most dangerous weapons of our enemy is the weapon of words. They call it peaceful solution when it is in fact the capitulation conditions. We are against it exactly because it's not a peaceful solution. We are against it exactly because it is another phase of forcing the Palestinian and the Arab people to kneel under the will of their enemies and by the force of the superior weapon and armies. To us, the peace is the justice. And this is why we consider that our people's war must be the war which ends all the wars. While the conditions of capitulation forced against us, forced upon us by imperialism, by Zionism, is the start of a new phase of wars. We fight for a real peace, and this peace cannot be achieved except when justice is built, when a progressive social society is built in Palestine, where every single person, not only in Palestine, but in all this part of the world, lives equally and share in building the destiny of his homeland.
This nation is going to continue fighting till victory. We achieved that our people could never be defeated. We achieved teaching every single person in this world that we are a small, brave nation who are going to fight to the last drop of blood to put justice for ourselves after the world failed in giving it to us. This is what we achieved.
People will often say, if the Palestinians wanted peace, why did they reject the 1937 Peel Commission plan by the British, which offered them 80% of the land and the Israelis only 20% of the land? This sounds like an amazing deal, doesn't it? In reality, this is a complete perversion of what the actual truth is, and any research into the history of Palestine or Israel will tell you the complete opposite. First of all, Eugene Rogan notes the solution proposed by the Peel Commission was partition. The Jews were to gain statehood in 20% of the territory of Palestine, including most of the coastline and some of the country's most fertile agricultural land, in the Jazeel Valley and the Galilee. The Arabs were allotted the poorest lands of Palestine, including the Negev Desert and the Arava Valley, as well as the hill country of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Not only was the land given to these Zionists much better than what the Palestinians had, but as Jewish people had moved to Palestine, they had formed a labour union known as the Histadrut. Now, the Histadrut believed in Hebrew exclusivist labour. This meant that they banned Palestinians from working on land that they had worked on for generations, and also they expelled Palestinians who lived within that land. This meant that many Palestinians had become unemployed, and also that Jewish society was strengthened. Because they had foreign capital flowing in from Keren K-Mont, or the Jewish National Fund, they were able to pay workers much higher wages than were those that were on offer to the Palestinians at the time. The Palestinian academic Ghassan Kanafani demonstrated masterfully in 1972 how this policy of exclusivist Hebrew labour had destroyed the Palestinian Arab economy. In Haifa, for example, in 1929, there were 12 Palestinian-owned soap factories. However, by 1935, this had fallen to only 4. This wasn't exactly some peaceful, wonderful time where Jewish immigration had no consequence for the Palestinian people, but rather it was a time where Palestinians were losing their livelihoods. The King Crane Commission, which was organised by the United States to look at the consequences of the Balfour Declaration, in August of 1919 stated that the establishment of a Jewish state cannot be accomplished without the gravest of trespasses upon the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. This concept of Hebrew exclusivist labour, coupled with mass immigration to Palestine, was always going to build a settler colonial society rather than simply immigrants coming to a place, because the difference between a settler and an immigrant is that an immigrant joins an existing polity, whereas a settler creates their own at the expense of the indigenous population. And this is exactly what the Zionist project did, and this is exactly why the Palestinians rejected the partition plan. What Hebrew exclusivist labour also meant was that Zionists were creating a society that was never going to be reliant on the indigenous population, and therefore the expulsion of 750,000 of them during 1948 held no consequences, because they could have their society where people were paid more through the funding of international donors. Another point which is made in On Palestine by Noam Chomsky and Ilan Pappé as a reason that the Zionist project was so willing to accept this peace deal was that David Ben-Gurion, the leader of the Zionist project at this time, was not a man who liked to show his hand, and rather he favoured a slow colonization of Palestine where small areas would be overrun with Jewish people, and it would mean that there was a high demographic and eventually they would be annexed into Israel. And this is why they were so willing to accept such a small swathe of land.
One of the most dangerous weapons of our enemy is the weapon of words. They call it peaceful solution when it is in fact the capitulation conditions. We are against it exactly because it's not a peaceful solution. We are against it exactly because it is another phase of forcing the Palestinian and the Arab people to kneel under the will of their enemies and by the force of the superior weapons and armies. To us, the peace is the justice. And this is why we consider that our people's war must be the war which ends all the wars.
Most of us who have encountered Zionists by this point have probably come to the conclusion that their version of events of what happened in 1948 is completely backwards. However, what I've also noticed is that some liberal supporters of the Palestinians will tend to get the history of 1948 wrong at certain points. The narrative is that the 1948 war is what led to the displacement of Palestinians. In actuality, the ethnic cleansing and displacement of Palestinians is what led to the 1948 war. The decision by the Arab League to declare war on Israel the day after its independence on May 15th of 1948 came far too late. By this point, 40% of the Palestinians expelled during the Nakba had already been expelled. Zionists will also pretend that they were completely outnumbered in 1948 because these 5 Arab nations were attacking this one Jewish nation. Zionists had 30,000 troops strong in May of 1948 compared to the Arab forces, which only had 13,000. And this shows how these Arab countries were extremely reluctant to help the Palestinians at first. But when you had hundreds of thousands of people pouring into these capital cities like Amman, Beirut, Damascus, and Cairo, the people of these countries forced their governments to do something. So in other words, the 1948 Arab-Israeli war was a half-hearted attempt by the surrounding Arab nations to save the Palestinians that came far too late. And this is what Zionists have done since 1948. They commit crimes against humanity, they provoke a response, and then they cry victim.
This is a people struggle for 106 years. 106 years because it all started here. The Balfour Declaration by the British Empire, where they promised our land without consulting us. And they turned us in that 67 words into non-Jewish minorities. We were 98% of the population. We had lived there for millennia. We were the cardinal of civilization. We produced every prophet. Palestine is the birthplace of Christianity. We were literally the hub of the region, the linkage between Europe, Asia, and Africa. And all of a sudden, we are only a non-Jewish minorities. And then Britain took over our land. And not only they denied our peoplehood and nationhood in 1917, but they denied us during the mandate our statehood, because the contract with the League of Nations was Britain will come and take mandate of Palestine to prepare us and to recognize us as a state as Palestine. You know what happened in the Nakba and the mass expulsion, the Jewish militias at the time ethnically cleansed 2/3 of our nation, including including my own parents. So
I know the history, and I have great sympathy, by the way, with what happened to Palestine.
Since then, my people, 67 and the military occupation that we discussed, since then, this is a people's struggle for freedom, for justice, for equality. This is a people's cry to survive, that this is a people's struggle for.
Ghassan Kanafani once famously wrote that first they steal your bread, then give you a crumb of it, then they demand that you thank them for their generosity. In honour of Taylor Swift's new album called The Tortured Poets Department, I am doing a series where we discuss actual real tortured poets. And today we will be discussing the life of Ghassan Kanafani, who was a Palestinian poet, writer, novelist, but also a prominent politician. He was born in 1936 in Acre, or Akka as it is known in Arabic more locally. As a child, he grew up watching his father, who was a lawyer called Faiz Abdul Razak, fight for the Palestinian nationalist movement, which fought against the British mandate of allowing Jewish settlers and Jewish immigrants to proceed into Palestine. He watched his father fight helplessly against colonial powers when he was constantly in and out of prison for his work on the movements. And then he also first-hand experienced the power of these colonial powers when he was displaced in the 1948 Nakba, fleeing through Lebanon and finally settling in Syria. Here he completed his education and got a teaching certificate and started teaching around 1,200 displaced Palestinian refugee children in local UNRWA schools. In 1952, he enrolled into the University of Damascus to study Arabic literature, but in 1955, before he could complete his thesis on the race and religion of Zionist literature, he was expelled from the university for his political affiliation with MAN, which was the movement of Arabic nationalists which focused on the unity of the Arab world, particularly in fighting British control and British mandate, specifically in the Palestinian area. It focused on introducing anti-colonialist policies towards the British and avenging the loss of Palestine. He moved first to Kuwait in 1956 following his brother and sister, and then to Beirut in 1960. It was here he took up an interest in Marxist philosophy and politics and married his wife, which he had 2 children with, before having to go underground undercover in 1962 as a stateless person who lacked proper ID and certification. He was vocal, especially in his writing, about using military means, including the use of arms, as being the only way to now solve the Palestinian tragedy. Most of his short stories and his work is written through a child's perspective, using the lens of childhood to talk about his political beliefs, the lack of education for these children, and the need to have education on their immediate surroundings. His work has been translated from Arabic into over 17 different languages and is critically acclaimed, including novels that you have probably heard of, such as Men in the Sun, All That's Left to You, and Return to Haifa. It was still in Beirut 1972 that Kanafani was assassinated by the Israeli Mossad along with his 17-year-old niece when a plastic bomb went off in his car when he turned his key in the ignition, killing them both instantly. Again, to end this video, I will be reading you another one of his poems, but please go out and read his novels, please go out and read his writing. He has quite literally died to get them to you, and they are brilliant. All your armies, all your fighters, all your tanks, all your soldiers, against the boy holding a stone, standing there all alone. In his eyes I see the sun, in his smile I see the moon, and I wonder, I only wonder, who is weak and who is strong, who is right and who is wrong. And I wish, I only wish, that the truth has a tongue.
I'm really enjoying Norman Finkelstein's Israel-Palestine scholarship, but it's making me really want to read Ghassan Kanafani's Palestine scholarship. Because Finkelstein is documenting the diplomatic and military history between the Arab states and Israel. And at many points in this book, it shows that the Arab leaders were willing to make concessions in order to have peace. First, they get pushed into, say, acknowledging Israel's right to exist, and then later on, they're abandoning the right for refugees to go back to their home. Basically, the Egyptian leadership had to say, we'll abandon the idea of repatriation for Palestinian refugees as long as we can achieve peace in the short term. And it's good to know that history, right? It's good to know that the Arab countries were willing to make concessions while Israel was hell-bent on expansionism, and they were incredibly obstinate towards diplomacy. But I know that an author like Ghassan Kanafani, who was an actual member of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, would never go back on supporting this idea of repatriation for Palestinian refugees, which is supported by the United Nations and international law. Basically, I know that in his scholarship, he doesn't have to make concessions to the Zionist entity, to the Israeli apartheid state. He doesn't have to say, sure, this murderous ethno-state has a right to exist. No, he can argue that ethno-states don't have a right to exist. You can't have an apartheid state that systematically deprives Arabs of their human rights. So basically what I'm saying is that it's interesting and informative to read about the diplomatic history of Israel, but after reading about all of Israel's crimes, I'm ready to read from a Palestinian revolutionary. I want to read from someone who was literally killed by the Mossad for his activism. That's the kind of scholarship I want to read, the kind of scholarship that made Israel feel like they had to kill you. Not to say Finkelstein's scholarship isn't amazing, and this book is incredibly important. Somebody had to write it. Somebody had to study the diplomatic and military record and record it in a way that's unbiased and debunks all of the Zionist myths and lies. But after 300 pages of that, I'm ready to read about revolution, baby.
I've been reading some classic works of Palestinian literature lately, and one thing I've read recently is Ghassan Kanafani's Palestine's Children. This is one of the most challenging books I've ever read, not in terms of the difficulty of the prose. At least in translation, Kanafani's writing is very straightforward, efficient, like a lot of wartime literature. And despite that, it's incredibly moving, but I was having to spend a lot of time digesting and processing each of these stories because I found this book extremely ethically challenging. Ghassan Kanafani was born in 1936. His family was expelled from Palestine during the Nakba of 1948. He lived in Syria, then Kuwait, and then eventually settled in Beirut, where he became a Marxist and became eventually the spokesperson of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, which was the Palestinian resistance movement located in Beirut. He was a very prolific writer. All of his journalism and short stories advocated for armed resistance. And the PFLP at this time was engaged in armed resistance against both military and civilian targets in Israel. They were responsible throughout the 1960s and 70s, when Kanafani was involved with them, for airplane hijackings as well as suicide bombings. I think it is important to note that Kanafani is remembered as the commando who never shot a gun. So although all of his literature was designed to inspire armed resistance, he himself, as far as I know, never took a life, was never on the front lines of fighting. His literature alone, however, was threatening enough to the Israeli state that they had him assassinated. The Mossad planted a car bomb in his car in 1972, and he was killed in the driveway of his home along with his 17-year-old niece, Lamis, in front of his children. All of the stories in Palestine's Children involve a child as a central character in the story. Some of the stories are about horrible things that the Israeli army is subjecting the children of Palestine to. And some of the stories are about children, mostly teenagers, picking up arms and choosing to fight against Israel. And those are the stories that were sort of the hardest for me to grapple with, and I'm still sitting with them and processing and unsure kind of how I feel about the whole thing. As someone from the US, born in the 1980s, I'm a Jewish American. Obviously, I've had like a wildly different life experience and context in my life from Kanafani. My relationship to anti-war literature, in the United States, almost all of our war literature is anti-war literature because we're in the imperial core, and most of the wars that we've been engaged in have been totally morally indefensible. Logically, do I believe that, colonized people experiencing violent imperialist colonization, are they, justified in self-defense and in violent resistance? Yes, logically, I believe that, pretty sure. The things the PFLP was doing, though, the suicide bombings and the airplane hijackings, were those things justified? Were they strategic for the, Palestinian resistance? That I'm really not sure about. I don't think I need to be the arbiter of that. Again, I'm just a white Jew from the US with a book talk account. One of the stories in here that I found the most challenging was called Guns in the Camp. It's about a father who's like an alcoholic. He mistreats his wife. He's been living in just regret and despair ever since the Nakba in a refugee camp. And he experiences like joy and hope for the first time in his life, seeing his very young teenage son picking up a gun at a rally, and like his son is going to go off and fight the Israelis, and he feels sort of pride and a reason to go on living for the first time, seeing his child carrying that gun. As a US parent, it is so hard for me to relate to that because my entire life context of kids picking up guns is kids going to school and shooting up the other kids in their school. And as a parent in the US whose kids go to public school, this is my nightmare that I think about every day of my life. So Kanafani and I are coming from just wildly different contexts. And yet we're both authors. I deeply respect the craft of this book. Some of the writing is incredibly moving, and I found myself agreeing with his arguments, being kind of carried along by the stories and then sitting with them afterwards and kind of wondering what that means. And this book has been hugely in conversation in my head with two other pacifist Palestinian authors that I've been reading recently. So Emil Habibi's The Secret Life of Said the Pest Optimist. I did an in-depth video on this a few videos ago if you want to go check that out. And also Raja Shahada. I read Palestinian Walks a few years ago, and just this past weekend I finished We Could Have Been Friends, My Father and I, a Palestinian memoir. Habibi was a lifelong pacifist. He devoted himself to trying to make gains for the Palestinian people through Israeli politics. So he ended up founding the Communist Party within occupied Palestine and was a member of the Knesset as a communist Palestinian politician. Something he was also very proud of was just the fact that he remained, in fact, so much so that on his tombstone he had it written, he remained in Haifa, is what is his epitaph there. And he was called a traitor for accepting an Israeli literary award. But he said, better we be trading awards and reading books than firing rockets at each other. So he was very critical of the kind of violent resistance that Kanafani was engaged in. Another Palestinian author who continues to live within the occupied territories, Shahada, is still very much alive and well and with us, thank goodness. And he has spent his life as a human rights lawyer, fighting both in Israeli courts and in international courts for the Palestinian causes. And he too talks about it in his literature and says that, he sees violent resistance as, it's not strategic, it's not helpful to the Palestinians, it's backfired, and he's devoted himself really to this humanitarian work instead. And so all three of these men had very different ideas about the best way for Palestinians to resist occupation and colonization. All three of them are critical of each other's politics, like in their books. Even among the two pacifists, like Shahada talks about how sometimes the Communist Party would shut down humanitarian projects that he and his father were working on. So all three of these men were really taking very different approaches to their resistance. And again, I think about how much their context matters. They were born in three successive generations. Habibi was born in the 1920s, Kanafani in the 1930s, and Shahada was born in 1950 after the Nakba. So each of them were actually born 15 years apart. Now, I have the humility as like a US Jew born in the 80s, very disconnected from all of this, to say that I am not in any way equipped to be the arbiter of who among them was right, who among them took the most strategic path towards Palestinian resistance. What I can say is that all three of these men dedicated their entire lives completely to helping their people to Palestinian resistance. And in addition to their political and legal careers in that arena, all three of them became authors, became storytellers. And I have deep respect for all three of them in terms of their craft and the books that they've, put out. And in some ways, I think it's that turn towards storytelling that is it's certainly the most long-term and perhaps the most enduring form of resistance that these men engaged in. I mean, decades after Kanafani was murdered, I'm reading his words now across continents, oceans, generations. These books are being taught in classrooms all over the world. A new generation of readers is discovering these authors. And so I want to put storytelling, we can all agree on. We can fight about the politics. We can fight about different ways of, what is the best way to resist? What is the most strategic way? You're always going to have factionalism and division among any kind of resistance movement. There's going to be more radical voices. There's going to be the voices calling for violent struggle, and there's going to be the voices calling for more strategic peaceful struggle and compromise and things like that. And they're going to be called sellouts, and the others are going to call the others unrealistic and destructive. And what about the backlash and this and that? And we can go on and on forever. But something I do think we can all agree upon is that storytelling is a really great form of resistance and is really, really powerful. And in fact, it is probably the most long-lasting and enduring form of resistance that any of these three men engaged in. And so if you are a book talker who is reading and sharing Palestinian stories, you are doing important work, really important work for the resistance movement. And if you are a content creator you are making original content about Palestine, even if you're just kind of boosting and retelling, a TikTok is not a novel, it's not a memoir, but it is a really powerful new form of storytelling and connecting that is creating this global resistance movement that is really unprecedented and powerful. So keep telling your stories, keep reading Palestinian stories, and we'll keep talking about it until Palestine is free.
51 years ago, the Israeli intelligence, the Mossad, assassinated Ghassan Kanafani, one of the most influential Palestinian Arab socialist thinkers and one of the greatest thinkers of the global South.
Everything in this world can be robbed and stolen, except one thing. This one thing is the love that emanates from a human being towards a solid commitment to a conviction or a cause.
But who is Ghassan Kanafani? Kanafani was born in the city of Akka in Palestine. Later on, he moved to the city of Jaffa, a city that featured a great deal in his novels and his writings and paintings later on in life. Like most refugees, Kanafani moved from one place to the other. Initially, he was expelled with his family, like 800,000 Palestinian refugees during the Nakba or the Great Catastrophe, from Jaffa or Jaffa to Lebanon, then Syria, then Kuwait, then Lebanon again, and so forth and so on. This story, that of the Palestinian refugees looking for a place, still factors in until this day. This is why the story of Ghassan Kanafani is not the story of the past, it's the story of the present. He was a visionary in that sense. He saw what was going on as part of the larger historical context of struggle against oppression. This is why he was an internationalist. But he also saw what would happen in the future if the Palestinian people do not resist. So for him, resistance was the cornerstone of the survival of the Palestinian cause. He never apologized about resistance and armed struggle. He never had to apologize or contextualize or explain himself. It was a right for Palestinians to resist because freedom is very precious and Palestinians have to fight for that right. Now, Ghassan Kanafani wasn't a fighter. He was one of the founders of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, a socialist Palestinian movement that's still quite influential until this day. Israel assassinated him anyway on July 8, 1972, along with his niece, Lamis. Kanafani's assassination did not end the story of Ghassan Kanafani. To the contrary, in many ways, he is actually more influential today than he was all of these years ago. Because now his writings and his novels and his plays are translated and sold and promoted in many countries around the world in so many different languages. In other words, Ghassan Kanafani is the quintessential Palestinian intellectual. He came from the people and he wrote for the people and he never apologized for the resistance of the people, and he died fighting for the people. But he never really fired bullets per se. Yes, he was one of the founders of the PFLP and he was a very influential part of that movement. But Israel feared him anyway. They feared him because they understood that his intellect and his ideas are traveling far beyond that of a small socialist movement in Palestine at the time. And they were becoming revolutionary ideas worldwide. This is why soon after he was assassinated, Ghassan Kanafani was awarded some of the most prestigious awards that the Global South can give anyone. It's important that we do not think of Ghassan Kanafani as a phenomenon from the past. But it's also important that we look into his work and his writings and his wisdom to try to navigate the present and our relationship with other countries and other national movements and other resistance movements around the world. Now we talk about intersectionality as if it's a new invention. In actuality, Ghassan Kanafani and his generation of Palestinian revolutionary intellectuals were the original intersectional intellectuals worldwide.
The Palestinian cause is not a cause for Palestinians only, but a cause for every honest person living in this planet.
There was so much evidence of this in his writings throughout the years. Kanafani was born in 1936 and he died in 1972. But his influence, his ideas, and his impact on Palestinian revolutionary thinking is stronger today than ever before. If you want more information about the writing of Ghassan Kanafani, check out some of his novels: A Death in Bed Number 12, Men in the Sun, and The Land of Sad Oranges. Or you can also go to the Palestine Chronicle and search the term Ghassan Kanafani. There's lots of material we have about this great Palestinian socialist, internationalist intellectual. Thanks for listening.
The US took an interest in Israel in the 1960s. Why? Because at the time, Arab nationalism and pan-Arabist and pan-Africanist movements in the Middle East and North Africa were very strong. These were movements towards socialism. They wanted to reclaim productive capacities. It was about national liberation. The US was not willing to accept the prospect of a liberated Middle East because that would impose and by the way, this is the center of the world, at the hinge of Africa and Asia and Europe, as this would impose very serious constraints on their ability to appropriate resources and labor from this region. And so they needed to intervene to crush these movements. And Israel was a crucial attack dog in doing so, right? The US armed them to the teeth, and they were sent after liberation movement leaders. They bombed the frontline states repeatedly, destabilizing them, forcing them to direct productive capacity away from national development towards defense, et cetera, et cetera. Israel has been crucial to US imperial strategy in the region for the past 50, 60 years. And this is exactly why, to this day, the US is actively supporting and arming the Israeli genocide against Palestine. right? Because they cannot stomach the possibility of a liberated Palestine. Because a liberated Palestine removes their key proxy in the region, right? And opens up the door to liberation movements across the rest of the Middle East. And that is highly antithetical to the interests of Western capital accumulation. And it's very clear that they are willing to go to extraordinary extents to prevent that occurring, to the point of debasing their own claims about human rights and international law, et cetera, completely flattening an entire society, extraordinary displays of hypocrisy against massive popular opposition. Why are they doing this? Because they understand that this is in the interests of the capitalist class. I think that's the key here. People will fall back on arguments about, oh, it's the power of AIPAC in US elections and so on, which is that's true, that's a real force. But I think
I would go further. It's not just AIPAC. I think large parts of the US state have been infiltrated by Israel. I think that's pretty obvious. I think the same is true in this country as well. I agree with you, though. That's only one variable next to a much bigger one, which is US empire.
ونغرق في دافئات المنى سنرجع مهما يمر الزمان سنرجع يوما إلى حينا ونغرق في دافئات المنى سنرجع مهما يمر الزمان سنرجع يوما إلى حينا ونغرق في دافئات المنى سنرجع مهما يمر الزمان.
Zionism was created by mostly non-religious Jews. It was a nationalist movement of people who estranged themselves from God, from the Torah. They were non-religious. Now, so in other words, in short and very concisely, Judaism is subservience to God. Zionism is nationalism. That's the difference between Judaism and Zionism.
Now, Israel is definitely not a democratic state, but it's also not a Jewish state. Israel is only Jewish in the same way that South Africa was white. It is not Jewish by religion. It is only Jewish by supremacy, by ethnicity. There are many myths that have to be dismantled. One of them is this notion that there are such two entities called Israel and Palestine living side by side in one way or another. But actually, Israel was built on top of Palestine and on account of the indigenous Palestinian people. That's how it was founded. So there is no Israel without Palestine. And the very existence of Israelis is on account of other people. Now, we're not saying that they don't have a right to live there, but no one has a right to live on account of other people. So what needs to happen in order for Israel to become a legitimate entity, it has to acknowledge the rights of the indigenous people, the ones that have been oppressed and subjugated ever since the creation of the State of Israel. The State of Israel was founded on the basis of ethnic cleansing and ethnic segregation. So its first laws were explicitly racist. There are 3 laws that explicitly use the term Jewish in order to give privileges to people of my ethnic background and deny the rights of the others. And there are many more laws. Today we have more than 50 of them that are implicitly racist, that depend on these formal laws. And there are many, many more practices that are racist. But by law, there is discrimination. And that legal type of discrimination against an ethnic or racial group is what falls under the legal definition of the crime of apartheid, as defined in the Rome Statute. So Israel neatly falls under the legal definition of the crime of apartheid, which is a very serious crime under international law. It's one of the few crimes that, along with genocide, that is regarded as a crime against humanity. So that is what we mean when we refer to Israel as an apartheid state. Now, adding to that, the Secret Security Service of Israel, the Shin Bet, stated in court that they are monitoring anyone who is acting against the Jewish character of the state, even if they do it legally. So basically, anyone who is promoting democracy, anyone who is promoting equality in Israel, is being regarded as some sort of a security threat to the state. So what does that tell us about the state?